Hello, I'm Edward Arnold,
And I'm Jeannie Arnold.
and we want to welcome you to the Arnold Showcase of Pennsylvania History. Pennsylvania has always been blessed with an abundance of great leaders and high achievers. This is true across government, business, the military, education, science, and the arts.
Unfortunately, too many of these remarkable individuals have faded into history or are not central figures in the lessons students are being taught today. Understanding and appreciating our past helps us to realize the opportunities and deal with the challenges ahead of us.
Jeannie and I are proud to sponsor this informative series to help citizens and students rediscover people who played tremendously important roles in our Commonwealth's historic journey.
We trust you will find their lives fascinating and their legacies powerful.
Hello, and welcome to the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, an appropriate backdrop for this edition of Rediscovering Pennsylvania History Makers. I'm your host, Charlie Greenewald. If you ask people to identify a landmark event in Pennsylvania history, chances are most would name the Battle of Gettysburg. No wonder. Robert E. Lee's 1863 invasion constituted the deepest penetration into the North the Confederate Army made during the Civil War. A desperate three-day battle ensued, culminated by the valor and violence of Pickett's charge. There were dramatic swings in momentum, controversial tactical decisions, heroic individual and small squad actions, heavy casualties, astonishing charitable and compassionate deeds, and a small town overwhelmed by disposing of the dead and caring for the wounded. Consider the indelible names of the instantly recognizable physical features: Little Round Top, Devil's Den, the Wheat Field, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and the railroad cut. In time, Gettysburg was recognized as the high watermark of the Confederacy, and it was a battle immortalized by Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, the most famous speech in U.S. history. As we would expect, a large number of Pennsylvania troops fought at Gettysburg. Pennsylvania units in the Army of the Potomac included 69 regiments of infantry, 9 regiments of cavalry, and 7 batteries of artillery. Counting regulars and militia, more than 34,000 Pennsylvanians in all. Nearly 1/6 were killed, wounded, or missing over the 3 days of the battle. Pennsylvanians were well represented among the officers of the Union Army. Generals from Pennsylvania played decisive roles in the conduct and the outcome of the battle. Nearly all performed exceptionally well. You can understand that defending native soil strengthened their resolve. We will look at 7 prominent generals from our Commonwealth. Each had established military or professional careers before the Civil War. 5 were graduates of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. 6 served during the Mexican-American War. 3 were in Florida during the Seminole Wars. 2 saw service on the western frontier. 2 were engineers. 1 was a surgeon. All were honored by monuments here at the Gettysburg National Military Park. We begin with the first of the generals to reach Gettysburg, John Fulton Reynolds, a career officer from Lancaster, a rising star who seemed to lack detractors in an army racked by vicious feuds among its officers. Reynolds was offered command of the Union Army when President Lincoln replaced Joe Hooker, but Reynolds could not be given assurance that command would be free from political interference, so he declined. Reynolds' arrival on the field was fortuitous, for the Union badly needed someone of experience, judgment, and command presence. But what happens next both sets and changes the storyline of the battle dramatically.
Reynolds is an incredibly aggressive guy. He's an aggressive general. He's collided with the Confederates, and he's going to fight them here, and he's going to fight them now. And by that decision, by doing what he did, by deciding to fight the battle out here, the rest of the Union Army of the Potomac and George Meade now have to react to what he does. So what Reynolds does ultimately, again, is he commits the Union Army to fighting a battle at Gettysburg. It's a huge decision. It affects the rest of the 3 days of the battle. Reynolds' death at about 10:30 in the morning on July 1st, 1863, has a profound impact on the rest of the Army of the Potomac, not just the men who are fighting here on the battlefield, but the men who are 30 miles away, the men who are marching to Gettysburg. One of the things that historians and students of the American Civil War will notice about John Reynolds is he's a guy that leads from the front. So one of the final acts of his life is he's leading forward members of the 2nd Wisconsin into the woods behind me in an attempt to drive out the Confederates who were swarming through the trees. And as Reynolds rides forward, right alongside the men, he turns to them and he shouts out, "Forward, for God's sakes, forward, and drive those fellows out of the woods." And then a moment later, he's struck in the back of the head by a Confederate bullet. One of the aides that was with John Reynolds, who saw him fall, said he never saw a bullet do its work so quickly. Reynolds was dead before he hit the ground.
3 statues of Reynolds at Gettysburg reflect the esteem felt for him: an equestrian statue on McPherson Ridge along the Chambersburg Pike, another inside the National Cemetery, and one on the Pennsylvania Monument. During 1862 and the first half of 1863, 4 Union commanders, George McClellan, John Pope, Ambrose Burnside, and Joe Hooker, all devised elaborate plans for defeating Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. Each came undone through excessive caution, overconfidence, loss of nerve, or most commonly, getting out-generaled. Lincoln's next choice for command is George Gordon Meade, an engineer in the pre-war Army. The Army of the Potomac was so riddled with political intrigue and infighting that when the messenger arrived to notify Meade of his assignment, Meade first thought that he was being arrested. It was 3 days before the opening clash at Gettysburg, and Meade was not even sure where the other parts of his army were. With the Confederate army streaming northward, Meade had no time to develop a big and bold plan as his predecessors had. He had to do 2 crucial things at once: catch Lee and protect the nation's capital.
To understand Meade's role in the battle, we have to remember that he accepts command of the Army of the Potomac the middle of the night, the 28th of June, 1863. So literally, he goes from commanding 10,000 men to commanding 95,000 men. He takes over this army mid-campaign while the army is on the move. He basically inherits the staff of the general before him, a man by the name of Joe Hooker. Some of those men were good, some of them were not. Some of them were loyal to Meade, some of them remained loyal to Hooker. He knows he's going up against Robert E. Lee, who, as of 1863, has a pretty darn good track record. And I think Meade also understands that the next battle he fights could decide the fate of the Republic. So there's an enormous amount of pressure on George Meade. And Meade has to think both offensively, but also defensively. So if you're the commander of the Army of the Potomac, you always have to protect Washington, D.C. You have to protect the capital. So Meade has to protect D.C. He also has to shield Baltimore from the Confederates. But the other half of his job is offensive. He's got to go after Robert E. Lee. He's got to destroy the Army of Northern Virginia. That's a lot to ask a guy who's told he's now in command in the middle of the night. It's a lot to ask of a man who receives command so unexpectedly. But here's what Meade does right. He adapts. Now, it wasn't his intention to fight the battle at Gettysburg the morning of July 1st, 1863. The battle happens almost by accident. It's a meeting engagement. And then a man that Meade really trusts, John Reynolds, commits the Union Army to battle. So Meade, he adapts. He's flexible. He's able, during the battle itself, to maneuver elements of his army, to shift men to where they're needed. And I don't think Robert E. Lee had ever gone up against someone like George Meade, who at Gettysburg does, again, a masterful job of fighting a defensive battle.
A pivotal event took place in this small farmhouse behind Union lines on the night of July 2nd. Meade convened a council of war to decide a very important question: whether to continue the fight at Gettysburg or to establish a battle line elsewhere.
as darkness is falling over the battlefield and as the sound of gunfire slowly disappears, George Meade will hold a meeting of his corps commanders. So Meade's going to take every major general he has left, a representative from every corps in the Army, and he brings them together in his headquarters, which is just a small whitewashed farmhouse once owned by a woman named Lydia Leicester. And in the evening hours, they meet and they talk about the situation. They talk about the condition of the Army. These generals discuss what to do the next day. Should they remain at Gettysburg? Should they fall back? If they stay at Gettysburg, should they counterattack? If so, how long should they wait before they do it?
Despite the victory achieved by the Union Army, Meade came under heavy criticism for not vigorously pursuing and crushing Lee's badly hurt army.
Meade has always had the reputation of being a good general, a competent general, but one that's slow, one that's cautious. There are other reasons why Meade didn't pursue as vigorously and as aggressively as a lot of people think he should. First off, you and I know that on the 5th of July, Robert E. Lee was in retreat, and he was ultimately headed back to Virginia, but George Meade doesn't know that. He doesn't know what Lee's plans are. Maybe Lee will remain on the offensive. Maybe Lee is going to offer battle in the passes of the South Mountains. George Meade doesn't know that. Also, one, Meade's army is exhausted. He's lost thousands of men. He has 22,000+ casualties in his army alone. His men are hungry. His men are fatigued. They do need rest. There's a lot that's playing into George Meade's thinking. There's a lot that's weighing on his shoulders by the 4th of July, by the 12th of July. And unfortunately for George Meade, the Confederate Army, they do escape, and the war goes on for another 2 years. But it's not simply an issue of George Meade was too slow, George Meade was too cautious.
Though thrust into a high-pressure situation without the advantage of assembling a loyal leadership team or gathering intelligence, Meade avoided the crippling errors of his predecessors. Without his competence in this hour of extreme crisis, the war could have ended quickly and catastrophically for the Union. Yet Meade does not receive the acclaim his defeat of Lee would seem to warrant. Maybe because Meade, a prickly personality lacking in charisma, died just 7 years after the war's end. His reputation suffered over time as survivors fought as aggressively over awarding credit and assigning blame as they had during Civil War battles. A successful commander needs a stalwart performer on the battle line. At Gettysburg, that performer was Winfield Scott Hancock. Hancock was a key figure for the Union side throughout, establishing the defensive position on Cemetery Hill on July 1st, feeding reinforcements at critical points during July 2nd, and commanding the line on Cemetery Ridge, attacked by Pickett on July 3rd.
Hancock is one of the heroes of the Battle of Gettysburg, and again, he seems to be everywhere at the exact right time. He's all over the battlefield. He's sent to Gettysburg by George Meade on July 1st to survey the situation, and George Meade entrusts the responsibility of selecting Gettysburg as the battlefield to Winfield Scott Hancock. On July 2nd, as the Union left is falling apart, as elements of the Confederate Army are driving back the Union defenders of the Peach Orchard and the Devil's Den, Winfield Scott Hancock is one of the men shuttling reinforcements that way. He seems to be everywhere on the battlefield right when the Union Army needs him. And I think Hancock had something about him. There was some element of his personality that made him a good commander, because he could command by sheer physical presence. One man said that just to be near Hancock made you feel safe, and men just naturally gravitated towards him wherever he was on the battlefield. One of the reasons that the Union Army won the Battle of Gettysburg was because of the generalship of Winfield Scott Hancock. Hancock certainly played a key, if not the deciding role in repulsing Pickett's charge. When you look at individuals who were responsible for driving back that assault, it's Winfield Scott Hancock, who's wounded at the height of the attack, and in a typical Hancock-esque move, he refuses to be removed from the battlefield until he knows the fate of the attack and that it's been successfully repulsed. And only then are his aides allowed to bring up an ambulance and remove him from the battlefield. Gettysburg is Hancock's defining hour.
On July 3rd, Hancock lined up against his pre-war friend, Lewis Armistead, who was leading the Confederate troops at the near breakthrough point of Pickett's charge.
So at this moment on July 3rd, you have these two men who at one time were friends. The but now find themselves on opposing sides in this great battlefield. Both are wounded. Hancock will survive his wound. Armistead will not. He dies a few days later. And the two never saw each other on the battlefield, though they were within, at one point, 100 yards of each other. I think that the Hancock-Armistead story says a lot about the nature of the American Civil War, in that it pitted not only brother against brother, but friend against friend.
Hancock the Superb, as he was nicknamed, also had a successful and important post-war career, overseeing the execution of the conspirators in the Lincoln assassination. He also held commands during Reconstruction and the conflicts with the Plains Indians. Democrats nominated him for president in 1880, an election he narrowly lost to James Garfield, another Civil War veteran. Hancock did win election for a different presidency, that of the National Rifle Association, and had the honor of presiding over Grant's funeral. John Gibbon, born in the Holmesburg section of Philadelphia, moved to North Carolina in boyhood. His 3 brothers and 3 other family members all fought for the Confederacy, but West Point graduate John Gibbon remained loyal to the Union. Early on, Gibbon led the famous Iron Brigade, tough Midwesterners identified by distinctive black hats.
John Gibbon was a professional soldier. He's very good at what he does. He was a good leader on the battlefield. He could command men in battle. And at Gettysburg, he commands a division in the 2nd Army Corps. And it just so happens that his division was occupying the center of Cemetery Ridge, which was really, as far as the final Confederate assault at Gettysburg is concerned, their focal point. So these 13,000 Confederates that move across the battlefield on July 3rd, they're really moving towards the position of John Gibbon and his men. Gibbon's on the field with his men during the attack. He's on foot. He's moving amongst the men. He's talking to them, encouraging them during the cannonade. And when the attack itself begins, and when the infantrymen start to open fire, Gibbon's there. So much so that he's actually wounded at the height of the battle on July 3rd. A Confederate mini-ball hits him square in the upper part of the arm by the shoulder, passes through his shoulder, and actually exits out of his back. It's a very painful wound. It's not necessarily a life-threatening wound, but it's incredibly painful. There's a story about John Gibbon that as he's being removed from the battlefield on July 3rd with this wound, his number one concern wasn't that he might die, or wasn't that he might lose his arm. His biggest concern was that he was afraid that people would think he had been shot in the back because of the exit wound. He thought that is where he was initially hit. And so I think that says a lot about John Gibbon. You have this guy who, as he's being removed from the battlefield, his number one concern is, I don't want people to think I was leaving my men. I don't want people to think I was a coward because of the nature of my wound.
Gibbon's serious wound took a long time to heal. Thus, he was present at the Gettysburg Cemetery dedication in November of 1863. However, Gibbon became tired of Edward Everett's lengthy oration, and he was off wandering the battlefield by the time Lincoln spoke his immortal words and missed the speech. Despite his pivotal role on July 3rd, his statue was not dedicated until 1988, 125 years after the battle. He was honored in death through burial in Arlington National Cemetery. Samuel Wiley Crawford, born in Franklin County, was a surgeon who moved to combat command of troops at Gettysburg who were not considered ready for combat. Yet late on July 2nd, the order to advance was given, and his moment occurred.
Samuel Crawford is a guy that's at the right place at the right time. He commands the remnant of one of the most famous units in the Union Army of the Potomac, the Pennsylvania Reserves. And they arrive on the northern slope of Little Round Top a little after 7 o'clock on the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863. And at this point in time, the Union defenders of the wheat field have been driven back. Victorious Confederates, men from South Carolina, Georgia, are advancing literally to the foot, Little Round Top. And he orders his Pennsylvania reserves into essentially a counterattack. And he leads them down the hill. He drives back these Confederates. And as far as Samuel Crawford is concerned, he saves the day, saves Little Round Top from capture. In an act of bravado to inspire his men, Crawford got the idea that he would take the flag of the 1st Pennsylvania Reserves and he would ride forward with the flag in hand with his men. And as Crawford tries to take the flag from the color bearer grabs the flag back and shouts up to Crawford, I mean, you can't take my flag. To which Crawford responds, don't you know who I am? I'm your general. Give me your flag. And the color bearer turns the flag over but refuses to let go of Crawford's pant leg. And as Crawford goes into battle with the flag of the 1st Pennsylvania Reserves, you have this lowly corporal tugging onto the general's pants to make sure that he doesn't get away. It's a humorous story. It's kind of one of those human interest moments that come out of the Battle of Gettysburg, but I think it also says something important about Samuel Crawford and what kind of leader he is. He's not a guy that leads from behind. He's a guy that leads from the front, and he's willing to do what it takes to inspire his men, even if it means riding forward with flag in hand to make sure his men drive back the Confederates. The land where his Pennsylvania Reserves fought, the land where he fought, was to him incredibly significant. It was hallowed ground. He lost men here. He came to the battlefield in 1872, and he was shocked by what he saw when he visited the spot on the battlefield where his men had fought. So what Crawford did was he negotiated with the landowner to purchase the land. And all told, he purchases about 42 acres in 1872 as basically a memorial park to where he fought, to where his men fought, to where they had saved the day on July 2nd, 1863. If it wasn't for individuals like Samuel Crawford, who took an active interest in saving and preserving the battlefield, we might not have the national park as it exists today. So Crawford is significant in the battle, certainly, but he's just as significant in the preservation of the battlefield.
Samuel Crawford holds the rare distinction of being a surgeon at Fort Sumter, where the first shots of the Civil War were fired, and being present at Appomattox for Lee's surrender when the guns went silent. John White Gary was born near Mount Pleasant in Westmoreland County. Before the war, he worked as a construction engineer on the Allegheny Portage Railroad, served as the first mayor of San Francisco, and was appointed governor of Bleeding, Kansas.
Gary himself is an incredibly brave guy. He's a competent guy. He's a competent general. He could command men by his physical presence alone. He's 6'6". He weighs about 250 pounds. And he had served very capably in the first couple of years of the American Civil War. He's wounded in 1862. He suffers a fairly serious wound at the Battle of Chancellorsville. But Gettysburg is not his defining hour. Gary's big role in the Battle of Gettysburg, besides his hesitancy to entrench and besides his getting lost on July 2nd, happens the morning of July 3rd, 1863, when he now will lead his men in a series of counterattacks that will ultimately drive Confederates off of the hill.
Geary later fought with distinction as part of Sherman's army in the Western Theater. After the war, Gary served 2 terms as Pennsylvania's governor. Reforms he recommended were included in the state constitution of 1874, portions of which are still in effect today. Gary died of a heart attack just weeks after leaving office. Alexander Hayes was born in Venango County. A West Point classmate of Hancock, he spent 6 years as a civil engineer in Pittsburgh, designing bridges. At Gettysburg, Hayes commanded a division under Hancock. Leading a counterattack against Pickett's troops, Hayes had 2 horses shot from under him, but was unhurt. In a letter home, Hayes eloquently stated the devotion that drove the Pennsylvania generals. I was fighting for my native state, and before I went in, thought of those at home I so dearly love. If Gettysburg was lost, all was lost for them. Regrettably, Hayes did not live to see the Union restored. He was killed during the Battle of the Wilderness the following year. We don't have enough time to detail the contributions of every Pennsylvania general at Gettysburg. The list includes stalwarts such as Andrew Atkinson Humphreys, David Bell Birney, and Samuel Zook. But one Pennsylvania general does deserve special mention: David McMurtry Gregg. Born in Huntington, led the cavalry force, preventing Jeb Stuart and his Confederate troops from striking the Union rear during Pickett's charge. However, most of the glory for that action was grabbed by a flamboyant general by the name of George Armstrong Custer, whose rendezvous with history at the Little Bighorn was 13 years in the future. Gregg outlived the other Gettysburg generals and had the honor of giving an address at the dedication of the Pennsylvania Monument in 1910. The expansive view from the top of the Pennsylvania Monument takes in much of the fighting fields from the 3 days of combat.
It's the largest single monument on the battlefield. Also, it's the most expensive. And by far, it's the most elaborate. It's the most prominent. In part because the state of Pennsylvania decided that they were going to honor not just the generals who fought the campaign, who led the events, but also the average soldiers who took part in the battle. So it has at the base different tablets that list all of the 34,000 plus Pennsylvanians who fought, and some of them who died in the Battle of Gettysburg.
The statues and the names on the bronze markers give deserved tribute to Pennsylvania's commitment to preserving the Union, the courage displayed, and the cost suffered.
As far as the individual people represented by the bronze statues on the Pennsylvania Memorial, you have two politicians. One is Andrew Curtin, governor of Pennsylvania, so certainly that makes sense. Andrew Curtin led the Commonwealth, led the state during the American Civil War. You have Abraham Lincoln, again, a worthy subject to appear on the Pennsylvania Memorial. The other individuals featured are all general officers from Pennsylvania who fought in the battle, men like Winfield Scott Hancock, who's one of the heroes of the battle. You have John Reynolds, who commanded the First Corps, was killed in the early stages of the battle. You have cavalrymen like David McMurdy Gregg, all officers who commanded large bodies of men who are from Pennsylvania. The angel at the dome, at the top of the dome on the Pennsylvania Memorial, again represents winged victory. She's got a sword in one hand, a palm leaf in the other as she advances forward across the battlefield. The statue itself is actually made of melted down Civil War cannon. So you have this kind of tremendously symbolic statue that's made from the remnants of weaponry that were once used during the American Civil War. So what was once used to take lives now represents peace on the battlefield.
In the summer of 2014, the Congressional Medal of Honor was awarded to Alonzo Cushing, 151 years after the battle. Cushing, an artillerist whose cannon were deployed at a central point on Cemetery Ridge, was severely wounded twice, but he remained with his battery, desperately defending against Pickett's charge, when a bullet through the mouth killed him. This long overdue recognition reminds us of how much the Battle of Gettysburg continues to resonate. Cushing's courage and sacrifice remind us why we remember the commanders and the soldiers who fought here. Gettysburg is probably the most studied and written about battle in American history, and each anniversary seems to spur additional interest and scholarship. New materials and new conclusions add fuel to old arguments. But what we do know for sure is that Pennsylvania troops and their commanders helped turn the tide at Gettysburg. We hope that this look at exceptional Pennsylvania generals has added to your knowledge and appreciation of these 3 decisive days in our nation's journey. I'm Charlie Greenewalt, and I thank you for joining us in rediscovering Pennsylvania's history makers.